I want a divorce. The words came out of Charlotte's mouth like a knife, slicing through the heavy air of the living room. She stood in front of the perfectly arranged coffee table, where design magazines nobody ever read lay untouched. David, sitting in the brown leather armchair, didn't look up right away. His phone still held his attention, as if the crumbling marriage in front of him were just another notification to be postponed. Charlotte crossed her arms, waiting for some kind of reaction. Nothing, not even a sigh. Her blood began to boil, and she said, with a hint of irony, "Of course I figured you wouldn't even say, what do you mean?" He finally looked up. His gaze was steady, but it didn't show shock or anger, just silence, a silence that seemed to stretch over all the years they had spent together. Then calmly, David placed his phone on the table, opened the side drawer of the console, and took out a small black leather box. He slid it toward her. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "What is this? You giving me jewelry as a consolation prize?" "Open it," he said dryly, without raising his voice. She hesitated for a moment. Her slender fingers, trembling with frustration, lifted the lid. Inside, there were no diamonds, no pearl necklace, just a worn-out notebook, faded brown with time-worn edges, an object that clashed with the luxury of the entire room. Charlotte let out a bitter laugh. "Seriously? You're handing me an old notebook on the day your wife asks for a divorce?" David didn't respond. He simply leaned back in the armchair as if he'd done his part. She opened the journal haphazardly, expecting to find blank pages. But right on the first page was a firm, familiar handwriting. His. "Our first dinner. You spilled wine on your blue dress and tried to pretend you didn't care. I thought it was the most charming thing I had ever seen." Charlotte blinked several times, confused. She turned the page. "The morning you burned the coffee and I drank it anyway, just to keep that smile on your face." Another page. "The day we had our first fight, and you ignored my texts for hours. I sat in the car, waiting for you to cool off, just to hear your voice again." Her hands were trembling, but not from anger. It was something else, a tightness she couldn't name. What is this?" she asked, her voice choked. David kept his eyes on her. "It's our years. I kept them." Charlotte let out a nervous laugh, almost a sob. "You kept them? Kept them for what? To write in secret while I thought you didn't care about anything?" He didn't answer. This time his silence didn't feel empty. It felt heavy, dense, like every word left unspoken over the years was stuck in his throat. She flipped through a few more pages hurriedly, like someone looking for proof. There were descriptions of moments she had already forgotten. A car ride in the rain, a night when she had the flu and he covered her with extra blankets, a laugh she let out while watching TV alone. But somehow he had noticed. Charlotte suddenly closed the journal and held it tightly against her chest. "No, this doesn't change anything." She spoke quickly, as if trying to convince herself. "You never showed affection. You were never really there. What's the point of writing things down if I spent all these years feeling invisible?" David sighed but didn't move a muscle. "Maybe I never knew how to show it." Charlotte fell silent. The sarcasm she always used as armor faltered. Part of her wanted to throw the journal back on the table, walk out of that room and never come back. Another part, a hidden part, tired of fighting, wanted to flip through more pages, to find out what else he had seen when she thought no one was paying attention. The words from the beginning still echoed in the room. "I want a divorce." But now they seemed smaller in the face of the weight of the unexpected gift. She stood up, taking the journal with her, and walked upstairs. Behind her, David remained still in the armchair, as if he knew there was nothing more to say. Charlotte entered the bedroom, closed the door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. She opened the notebook again. There they were, the two of them, in versions she didn't remember, but that he had preserved with quiet devotion. The tears began to fall before she could stop them, and for the first time in many years, Charlotte wasn't sure she really wanted that divorce. The cup slipped from Charlotte's hand and shattered on the kitchen floor, dark coffee spreading like a stubborn stain over the light marble. She didn't bend down to clean it up. She just stood there, watching the liquid seep into the cracks, as if it were the perfect metaphor for the years of marriage that had slipped away with no return. The night before, she had gone up to the bedroom with the journal in her hands and hadn't been able to sleep. She read until her eyes burned. Each page brought back not just memories, but also the weight of the loneliness she had always felt by David's side. It was like watching a silent movie of her own life, familiar images, but no sound, no embrace, no human warmth. Now, in the kitchen, lit by the morning sun, Charlotte mentally relived birthdays where she spent hours getting ready, only to cut the cake alone because her husband had an urgent meeting. Charity events where they would arrive together, and minutes later he'd vanish into a crowd of investors, leaving her smiling at strangers. Nights when she lay next to him, counting the cracks in the ceiling while he slept, turned the other way, breathing heavily, as if sleep were more intimate than his own wife. She grabbed a cloth and slowly bent down, cleaning up the coffee. As she scrubbed, she remembered the words she had read in the journal. With every birthday I missed, I hated myself more than I ever thought possible. I wanted to be there, but I didn't know how to stop the outside world. Charlotte stopped scrubbing and placed her hands on the cold floor. The irony made her smile bitterly. Great, so I spent all these years talking to the walls while you were secretly writing poetry. Sarcasm was the only way to ease the pain. She stood up, put the cloth away, and took a deep breath. She walked into the living room, where wine glasses from the night before still sat. She remembered when they used to toast to anything, a signed contract, a planned trip, even a lazy Sunday. Later, the habit faded. Silence took the place of celebrations. With the journal in her hands again, Charlotte sat on the couch and flipped through a few more pages. She found descriptions of tiny gestures. The day you dropped your purse at the grocery store and laughed nervously. I thought your laugh was sweeter than any song. That afternoon you waited for me, even though I was late, and pretended you weren't mad, just so you wouldn't ruin the outing. Each detail, each memory, showed he had been paying attention, even when he seemed distant. But that didn't erase her loneliness, because in practice he didn't say anything, didn't hold her, didn't show up when it mattered most. Charlotte shut the journal forcefully, as if trying to silence the voice coming from its pages. She got up and walked through the mansion, moving through immaculate yet cold rooms. The dining room looked like a museum, gleaming chandeliers, a table always set, but no laughter, no mess, no sounds of family. She remembered a specific night. It was Christmas Eve. She had made an entire dinner by herself, hoping David would at least sit with her. He showed up late, phone pressed to his ear, mumbling about numbers, stocks, deadlines. He took 2 bites, gave a robotic compliment about the seasoning, and went upstairs to his office. Charlotte stayed alone at the table, candles burning down to nothing. While she listened from afar to the sound of his keyboard, she took a deep breath, trying to push the memory away, but the journal kept dragging her back. In its pages, he had written, "That Christmas, I saw the sadness in your eyes. I should have dropped everything and sat with you. I didn't. I've never forgiven myself for it." Charlotte pressed her lips together, holding back the anger. "So you noticed. You always noticed. And still, you didn't lift a finger." It felt like she had lived in a monologue of a marriage. She spoke, cried, begged for attention. He silently recorded everything, turning it into words she was only now discovering. The weight of it all crushed her chest. She sat again, now at the bottom of the stairs, and laid the journal across her knees. Her racing heart beat hard against the thin fabric of her clothes. It was suffocating to think that all of it had been right there in front of her the whole time, hidden in drawers, while she felt invisible. The sound of a car passing outside brought her back to the present. Charlotte quickly wiped her eyes, as if unwilling to admit she had been crying. She stood with effort and walked to the window. Outside, the perfectly manicured garden gleamed in the morning sun. Aligned roses, trimmed grass, the wind rustling the leaves. Everything looked perfect, just like her life was supposed to seem to anyone watching from the outside. Inside, however, she felt like an abandoned plot of land, full of cracks no one cared to fix. She ran her finger over the journal's spine, feeling the roughness of the cover. Part of her wanted to rip it to pieces, throw it all in the trash, a form of revenge against the years of silence. Another part, however, wanted to keep reading, to dive in completely and understand what was really going on inside the head of the man she thought she knew. The dilemma consumed her, and deep down there was a fear she didn't want to admit. What if, after reading everything, she discovered she had never truly known David? That he was a stranger watching from a distance, never brave enough to come close. Charlotte walked back to the bedroom, holding the journal close to her chest. She sat on the bed and opened to a page marked with a fold. "You never knew, but sometimes I stayed awake just to hear you breathe. It was the only sound that reminded me something was still alive between us." She closed her eyes, and a single tear slid down her cheek. For a moment, she wanted to believe, wanted to think there had been love hidden there, lost among the pages and the silence, but the loneliness of the years weighed more than any written phrase. She lay on her side, holding the journal like one holds both a weapon and a comfort. Her mind swirled with painful memories, but also with the strange sensation of being seen, for the first time, even if it was too late. Charlotte didn't know what to do. She only knew that, from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. "He gave you a notebook?" Marcia nearly spit out the sip of wine she had just taken, her eyes wide as if she'd just heard the biggest joke of the week. Charlotte set her glass down on the table of the neighborhood cafe and sighed, already bracing for her friend's explosive reaction. This was their safe haven, a charming little coffee shop tucked between antique store windows and a bookstore that was always having a clearance sale. Here, women of all ages traded secrets, as if every table were an unofficial confessional. "It's not just a notebook," Charlotte replied, trying to stay composed. "He wrote things, memories." Marcia raised a hand in the air like she was calling for a timeout. "Wait, are you telling me the man who ignored you for years, who preferred to sleep with his laptop than with you, decided to make it up to you with notes? Girl, you deserve diamonds, not recycled paper." Charlotte let out a brief, nervous laugh. I know, but it's not that simple." "Oh, of course it's not simple," Marcia shot back, gesturing as if performing for an invisible audience. "You spend years begging for attention. He acts like he doesn't hear you, and now he shows up with a diary like it's some long-lost love letter. Classic." The waiter passed by, and Marcia took the opportunity to order another cappuccino. Charlotte, silent, fiddled with a folded napkin, crumpling it between her fingers. Her friend spoke with such certainty, it was almost suffocating. "Listen, Marcia, I read a few pages." Charlotte took a deep breath, unsure if she was ready for the reaction. "He remembered things I didn't even remember anymore, small details, like the day I spilled wine on that blue dress." "Details, Charlotte?" Marcia interrupted, almost slapping her hand on the table. "You don't need a husband who takes note of fashion mishaps. You need someone who holds you when you cry, who sits with you at Christmas dinner, who turns off his damn phone." Her friend's words cut like a knife, sharp truths Charlotte herself had been screaming internally for years, and yet something in those pages kept tugging at her. "I can't explain it," she said, her voice lower now. "It felt like, in some way, he was there. He just never knew how to show it. Marcia leaned across the table, lowering her voice too, but with an edge in her eyes. Girl, don't fall for this. It's textbook. The guy disappears, doesn't show up, and then says, "But I always loved you," in silence. You know what that is? Emotional laziness. It's wanting applause without ever doing the work. Charlotte didn't answer, just bit her lower lip. The cafe buzzed around them, clinking silverware, laughter from a group of older women at the next table, the hum of the espresso machine. Life was moving on, but she felt stuck at a crossroads. Marcia leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, still fuming. If he'd given you flowers every day, you'd have something to remember. If he'd taken you on trips, you'd have stories to tell. But what did he do? He wrote in secret, like some moody teenager. That's not love, Charlotte. That's cowardice. The words rang loud and clear. Still, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling she'd had while reading the journal. It wasn't just cowardice. There was vulnerability there. A man who never knew how to speak, but who somehow had been paying attention. I kept the journal, she said quietly. I couldn't throw it away. Marcia's eyes widened again. Of course you kept it, because deep down you're still hoping he'll change. Charlotte opened her mouth to respond but gave up. She knew her friend was speaking from experience. Marcia had been through 2 painful divorces and always spoke with the conviction of someone determined not to let another woman fall into the same trap. Their conversation was briefly interrupted when the waitress brought the extra cappuccino. Marcia thanked her with an automatic smile, then turned back to Charlotte. Look, girl, here's the deal. We women spend our lives waiting for recognition. And just when we finally stop waiting, someone shows up trying to make us believe they've been there all along in silence. I've heard that before. And you know where it led me. Court. Charlotte took a deep breath. Her friend's voice was steady, but the doubt inside her was growing louder. The journal was tucked in her bag, resting like a heavy secret. And despite all of Marcia's sarcasm, Charlotte knew she'd open it again that night. They sat in silence for a few moments. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the sound of spoons clinking against cups. Marcia changed the subject, commenting on the neighbor who had already changed cars 3 times that year, but Charlotte barely heard her. Her mind was lost in those yellowed pages, in the handwritten words that somehow spoke louder than all the arguments she had ever had with David. On the drive home, cruising down tree-lined streets, Charlotte replayed everything Marcia had said. Every line made sense, and yet no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't forget the intimate tone of those memories. When she pulled up in front of the mansion, she grabbed her purse and held the journal for a moment before stepping inside. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have. She put it back, climbed the stairs, and entered. The echo of her heels in the empty hallways was a familiar sound, like the soundtrack of the loneliness she'd lived with for years. In the bedroom, she opened the vanity drawer and placed the journal inside, shutting it quickly, as if afraid the words might escape. She leaned against the bed and closed her eyes. Marcia's voice still echoed, "You deserve diamonds, not paper." But Charlotte's heart insisted on holding on to that paper like it was gold. "Good morning, Mrs. Van Doren." Lucas's voice came from behind her as he adjusted the garden hose, watering the neatly aligned rose bushes in front of the porch. Charlotte stopped walking. She had stepped outside to breathe in the morning air, trying to shake off the weight that had settled on her chest since Marcia had torn apart David's gift at the cafe. The journal was still tucked away in the vanity drawer, but it felt like it called to her every minute, as if the pages themselves were a living presence in the house. She turned to Lucas. The gardener's light shirt clung to his body with sweat, and the sun highlighted the damp sheen on his young skin. He looked up and smiled, a natural, unassuming smile, the kind that reminds you someone is actually seeing you. "Good morning," Charlotte replied, adjusting the light scarf she wore despite the heat, as if shielding herself from being too visible. "The roses are beautiful today," he said, gesturing proudly toward the flowers. "It's the time of year when they seem most alive." Charlotte looked at the bright red petals, open and vibrant, and couldn't help the bitter comparison. The flowers were blooming more than her marriage. "They are beautiful," she said softly, almost distracted. Lucas turned off the hose and stepped a bit closer, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Do you like roses?" Charlotte let out a short, ironic laugh. "I do, but I can't even remember the last time someone brought me a bouquet." The comment slipped out before she could stop it. Lucas raised an eyebrow, curious, but didn't press. He only said, "Then someone's missing a good opportunity." The simple sentence echoed inside her in an odd way. It wasn't blatant flirting, nor was it intrusive. Just a straightforward observation, but it hit exactly where it hurt. Charlotte looked away, walking along the porch. "Flowers are just flowers, Lucas. They last a week, then wilt." "Not always," he replied lightly. "Some flowers leave a mark even after they're gone." The silence that followed felt heavier than the conversation itself. Charlotte realized she was smiling, something rare these days. And for a moment, she felt something that didn't come from a notebook hidden in a drawer, but from a present gaze, a simple exchange. She stepped off the porch and walked toward the garden, letting her hand brush over the wet petals. The scent of the roses wrapped around her, bringing back memories of when she still found wonder in small gestures. In the early years of their marriage, David had also planted flowers for her. But over time, the garden had become just another part of the mansion, maintained by staff. Lucas watched her, and Charlotte could feel it. It was different being seen. A sweet discomfort, as if she had suddenly become a woman again, not just a decorative piece in someone else's life. "Is Mr. Van Doren traveling?" he asked, trying to make conversation. "No," Charlotte replied immediately, but then thought better of it. "I mean, he's here, but he might as well be in another country." Lucas didn't say anything. He simply nodded, understanding, like someone who had heard plenty of stories about loneliness disguised inside homes that were far too big. Charlotte realized she'd gone too far with the comment and tried to change her tone. "You do a great job with the garden." "Thank you." He smiled again. "You should spend more time out here. It's peaceful, different from the rest." She held his gaze for a few seconds. There was something disarmingly sincere in that suggestion. Charlotte stepped back, returning to the porch. "Maybe I will." Lucas went back to work, but the image of him lingered in her mind. Simple, attentive, present. The contrast with David was unavoidable. While her husband seemed distant, even when only a few feet away, the gardener noticed her even in silence. Later, inside the house, Charlotte caught herself watching through the window as Lucas trimmed the lawn. There was nothing inappropriate about the scene, but the feeling growing inside her was dangerous. It wasn't infatuation or sudden desire. It was simply the sweet taste of being noticed, something she hadn't felt in years. She walked into the bedroom and opened the vanity drawer. The journal was there, still and waiting for her hands. She ran her fingers over the cover, but didn't open it. Not now. Something in her mind was pulling her outward, to the garden, to the living presence Lucas represented. She sat on the edge of the bed, confused. Marcia had been right when she said Charlotte deserved more, and maybe more was exactly this: a light conversation, a sincere gaze, someone who was actually there. The afternoon sun began slipping through the slats in the curtains. Charlotte got up and returned to the porch. Lucas was putting away his tools, getting ready to leave. Before stepping into the modest car parked discreetly beside the house, he looked up and saw her watching. He smiled. Charlotte, without thinking, smiled back. Her heart beat faster, not because of the gardener himself, but because of what that moment symbolized. a reminder that it was still possible to feel alive, to feel seen. She quickly shut the curtains and pressed her forehead to the glass. Still, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't push the journal's silent presence from her mind. Behind all of Lucas's unexpected attention were pages and pages written by David, pulling her back. Charlotte realized she was trapped in a dilemma: the freshness of being noticed now, or the weight of memories stored in silence. And for the first time, she understood that maybe the real danger wasn't Lucas, but in the feeling that deep down, there still might be something left to rescue in David. The sharp sound of the drawer slamming echoed through the room. Charlotte had closed it harder than she meant to, as if trying to lock away the journal that kept calling to her. But minutes later she was back, opening it again. She picked up the notebook with restless hands, sat on the bed and rested it on her knees. It was no use. No matter how hard she tried to resist, something in that writing kept pulling her back, as if each page were a warped mirror of her own life. She opened to the first folded corner she found and began to read. That night you cried alone in the bathroom. I stood outside the door listening. I wanted to knock, to tell you I was there, but I froze. I didn't know if you wanted comfort or if my presence would only make it worse. So I stood there, listening to your sobs, hating myself for not having the courage. Charlotte brought a hand to her mouth, trying to contain the shock. She remembered that night exactly. They had fought again because he had missed another important dinner. She locked herself in the bathroom and cried until time lost meaning. She thought she was alone. Now she knew he had been right there, on the other side of the door, unmoving. With trembling hands, she turned the page. You never knew, but after every fight, I always wanted to hold you. I didn't because it felt like it was already too late. Your words came sharp, and I didn't know how to defend myself without hurting you more. So I swallowed everything and wrote it here because it was the only way not to lose my mind. Tears began to well up in Charlotte's eyes. The writing wasn't just memory, it was confession, a silent testimony from a man who, in front of her, had seemed made of stone, but who, on paper, revealed deep cracks. She kept reading, barely breathing. The day you stormed out and drove around for hours with no destination. I kept watching the clock, afraid something would happen. I called over and over, and you didn't pick up. When I finally heard the car in the driveway, I felt a relief I never confessed. You came in, didn't speak to me, went straight to the bedroom. I wanted to run to you and hold you, but I couldn't bring myself to. Charlotte let the journal fall onto her lap and buried her face in her hands. The memory of that day was still vivid. She had been furious, feeling invisible, and decided to disappear. She came back late, certain he wouldn't even notice. But he had recorded it. She picked up the journal again, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her dress. I saw you change. I saw when you stopped laughing at the little things. I saw when you stopped dressing up for dinners and preferred to stay in the bedroom. I saw sadness take the place where joy used to live, and I never knew how to fix it. I wrote everything here like a coward because I didn't have the strength to look you in the eye and admit I failed. Charlotte squeezed her eyes shut. Every sentence felt like a wound being reopened. She remembered each of those moments, but always from her side, as the ignored, the lonely, the unseen. Now the journal showed there was another side, equally painful, equally powerless. She flipped through more pages. There were nights I wanted to lie beside you and just hold you, but I'd see your tired face, your heavy eyes, and I thought there was no space left for me. So I stayed still, afraid any gesture would be rejected. I knew you were still there, but I didn't know how to reach you. The tears flowed freely now. Charlotte sobbed silently, remembering all the nights she had felt alone beneath the covers. She had never imagined that he had been awake too, lying next to her, afraid. She closed the journal for a moment, trying to catch her breath. The room spun around her. The bed, once a place of rest, had become a stage for revelations that cut deep. But as if she couldn't stop herself, she opened it again to another entry. I was never good with words. I always feared saying the wrong thing, feared you'd laugh at me or drift even further away. So I wrote everything, every detail about you that reminded me why it was still worth trying. I wrote because it was the only way not to lose you completely, even if you never knew. Charlotte let out a soft, broken sound, pressing the journal to her chest. It felt like those pages were the embrace she had never received. Lucas's image suddenly flickered in her mind, the young smile, the direct gaze, the freshness of being noticed. But in the face of David's confessions, the gardener seemed distant, almost irrelevant, because what was written here came from years of shared life, of silent pain, of knowing and failing and still trying. She took a deep breath and kept reading. What scares me most is the thought that you'll leave without ever knowing how much you were loved. Maybe it wasn't enough, maybe I didn't show it right, but every gesture, no matter how quiet, was love. I just never knew how to show it. Charlotte couldn't hold back any longer. The tears streamed down in waves, soaking the pages. She pressed her face to the journal, as if trying to merge with the words. There were no diamonds, no luxury trips, no lavish gifts that could compare to this. This was raw love, imperfect, poorly expressed but real. She lay down, still holding the notebook, clinging to it like the last anchor in a turbulent sea. And as the tears fell, she realized something she had never admitted before. Beneath all the anger, there was still space to recognize that maybe, just maybe, she had never really been alone. The office door slammed as Charlotte walked in unannounced. The sound echoed through the quiet room, making David immediately look up from his computer. He raised his eyebrows, startled by the sudden intrusion. Charlotte clutched the journal against her chest like it was a piece of evidence. Her eyes were red, not just from anger, but from sleepless nights and tears held back. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" she demanded, no preamble. "Why write all of this and never talk to me?" David slowly closed his laptop, as if needing time to form a response. He took a deep breath and rested his elbows on the desk. "Because every time I tried, it felt like you had already stopped listening." Charlotte laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Oh, right. So now it's my fault? I asked for years, David. I begged for a gesture, a word, anything, and you gave me silence. Now you're telling me it's because I wasn't willing to listen?" He kept his gaze on her, steady, but not defensive. "I know I failed," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not how you think. I wasn't indifferent. I was lost." Charlotte lifted the journal and shook it at him like a weapon. "Lost? No, you knew exactly what you were doing. You were writing in this, hiding from me what you should have said out loud. You let me believe I was invisible." David stood up, walked around the desk, and stopped a few steps from her. His face showed exhaustion, not physical, but the kind that comes from years of build-up. "You were never invisible. I saw everything, Charlotte, every detail. I just didn't know how to turn what I saw into something real without it feeling fake, so I wrote." She felt a lump rise in her throat, but refused to let him see her weakness. "And you think that comforts me? That it helps to know you were holding all of this inside while I lay in bed next to you feeling completely alone?" David sighed and ran a hand through his hair, visibly tense. "I never wanted you to feel alone. I just didn't know how to change what had grown between us. And every time I tried, it only seemed to make things worse. So I stayed quiet." Charlotte stared at him for a long moment. There was something in his eyes that disarmed her, even when she didn't want it to. The sarcasm she so often used as armor wavered for a second. "You let me believe I didn't matter," she said, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. "You let me believe it was over." David stepped forward, hesitating before coming any closer. "I never stopped loving you, Charlotte. I just didn't know how to show it." She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. Part of her wanted to scream, to throw the journal in his face and walk away. Another part wanted to believe, wanted those words to be enough to rebuild something that had long seemed broken. "It's too late," she murmured, but even she didn't believe her own voice. David noticed the hesitation, and for the first time in a long while, the hardness in his face softened into something more vulnerable. "Maybe it is, but if it is, at least now you know the truth. I don't have to hide behind silence anymore." Charlotte looked down at the journal in her hands. The yellowed pages seemed to pulse with the weight of their memories. She was torn between the anger of the past and the weight of what had just been revealed. "I don't know if I can trust this," she said, more to herself than to him. "I'm not asking you to trust it right away," David replied, steady but gentle. "I just want you to know that every word is real." Silence settled over the room. Charlotte held the journal against her chest like a shield. David remained where he was, neither moving closer nor backing away. The weight of their years of silence hung between them like a wall, but for the first time there was a crack. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her thoughts. "You write like you were always there beside me, but I lived through all of it like I was alone. How do you reconcile those two things?" David looked at her with a mix of pain and hope. Maybe now is the time to learn how to speak. Charlotte didn't reply. She simply turned, left the office, and walked upstairs, the journal still in her arms. Behind her, David stood frozen, as if he had just played the last card in a long and weary game. In the hallway, Charlotte leaned against the wall, her heart pounding. This wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was just the beginning of a conversation that had taken far too long to start. "Don't make that face, Charlotte." Marcia's voice cut across the kitchen table like a verdict. "He's just trying to hold on to you. That journal is the final move of a man who doesn't know how to lose." Charlotte set her teacup down hard on the saucer, the liquid splashing onto the white tablecloth. Her heart was still racing from David's words in the office. The pages of the journal, tangled with the confrontation from the night before, wouldn't leave her mind. "You don't understand, Marcia," she began, but her friend raised a hand, impatient. "Understand what?" Marcia leaned forward, her tone firm. "You've spent years calling me in tears, complaining about his silence, his coldness, the loneliness in that mansion. Now he shows up with a handful of written pages and suddenly you're emotional? Are you serious?" Charlotte sighed, exhausted. "It's not just a handful of pages, it's his whole version of our life. I don't know how to explain it. It's like he saw everything I went through, even when I thought I was completely alone." Marcia rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed. "Big deal. I see everything my neighbor does, and I'm not looking to marry her. Come on, girl. This is emotional manipulation. He couldn't love you in real time, so now he wants you to accept some kind of love from a dusty archive." Charlotte gave a small, bitter smile. "You always go overboard." "Me?" Marcia slapped her hand on the table. "Overboard is believing that a notebook can replace years of affection." Charlotte said nothing, stirring her now cold tea. Her friend's sarcasm carried a sting of truth, but something inside her couldn't bring itself to dismiss the written words entirely. Later, while walking through the hallway of the mansion, Charlotte heard voices coming from the garden. The curtain was slightly open, and she saw Lucas packing up his tools, talking to another worker. When he noticed her standing at the window, he looked up and smiled. It was an easy smile, clean, light, free of confessions or guilt. Charlotte felt a strange warmth in her chest. She stepped down to the porch and found him just getting ready to leave. "Heading out early today?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Finished quicker than I expected." Lucas adjusted the strap on his backpack. "The garden's been looking so good, it makes the work easy." Charlotte let out a soft laugh. "Well, at least something in this house is in order." He looked at her directly without looking away. "You should spend more time out here. Fresh air helps clear the mind." Charlotte felt a chill, not from the wind, but from his words. It wasn't blatant flirting, but there was something in his tone that felt like an invitation. For a moment, she considered accepting it, letting herself be carried by the simplicity of a light conversation, by the rare sensation of being truly seen. But she quickly pulled back, reminded of the journal still waiting upstairs. "Maybe," she replied in a neutral tone. "Good night, Lucas." He nodded, got into his modest car, and drove away. Charlotte stayed on the porch, watching the red taillights fade down the street. Her heart was beating faster than it should have been. Back in the bedroom, she opened the drawer of the vanity. The journal was there as always, waiting. She picked it up gently, sat on the bed, and flipped through a few pages. The memories of David came rushing in like a dam breaking. Yes, there had been silence, but also countless small gestures she had never noticed. Marcia's words echoed, "He's just trying to hold on to you." Lucas's carefree smile was still fresh in her mind. But as Charlotte ran her fingers over the written lines, she realized that none of it compared to the weight of the journal. Inside it was history, pain, memories that belonged only to the two of them. Lucas represented a possible new beginning, an easy escape. Marcia represented the definitive break, the bravery to walk away. But the journal was an anchor. And as much as it hurt, it was still where Charlotte's heart insisted on resting. She closed the notebook slowly, pressing the cover to her chest. The tears came silently, not out of anger, but from the quiet certainty that despite all the advice, something deep inside her still wasn't ready to let go. Tears fell onto the final page, smudging the ink in a few places. Charlotte held the journal tightly in both hands, her chest rising and falling as if she had just run miles. The room was silent. Only the distant sound of wind against the windows accompanied her sobs. She had spent hours reading, turning page after page, until she reached the end. And there it was, written in David's same steady handwriting, a single sentence that seemed to close a circle. "If one day you decide to leave, I want you to know that even in silence, I was always with you." Charlotte closed her eyes and rested her forehead against the journal. Every word echoed like both a punch and an embrace. She remembered all the nights she believed she wasn't loved, all the birthdays she spent feeling forgotten, all the arguments where she swore he didn't care. And now, she discovered that the love had been there. It just had never been shown in the way she expected. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her lift her head. David stood in the doorway, not knocking, watching her from a distance. His face carried the same weariness of the past few days, but there was something new in his eyes, fear, the fear that even after revealing the journal, she might still choose to leave. Charlotte took a deep breath, wiping her face with the sleeve of her blouse. She couldn't speak right away. She simply held up the journal and showed it to him, as if that alone was enough. "You wrote all of this, and never said a word," she whispered, her voice fractured. David stepped into the room but stopped halfway, keeping a respectful distance. "I didn't know how. I thought my words always came out wrong, so I kept them inside." Charlotte opened the journal again, tracing the final sentence with her fingers. "You knew I was feeling alone. You saw it. You documented it. And even then, you never tried to change it." "I did try, Charlotte." His voice shook, but every time it felt like it wasn't enough. So I went silent, and the silence became a wall I didn't know how to break. She stared at him for a long moment. The tears returned. But this time, they weren't just pain. There was something else now, something fragile that hadn't been there before. A crack in the wall. Charlotte closed the journal slowly and laid it gently on the bed. She stood, walked over to David, and stopped in front of him. "I don't know what's going to happen to us," she said firmly. "But I know this divorce isn't happening right now." David took a deep breath, and for a moment he looked like he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He just nodded, like a man who had finally been handed a second chance and knew he couldn't waste it. Charlotte returned to the bed, sat down, and picked up the journal again. She looked at him, and for the first time in many years, she didn't feel just anger or frustration. She felt something else, hope. Shy, fragile, but real. She didn't say another word. She just held the notebook against her chest, letting the silence of that night be different from all the others. Not an emptiness, but a space where something new could begin. David remained standing, watching her, not daring to break the moment. Charlotte kept her eyes on the words still echoing in her mind. "I was always with you." And for the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, there was still something left between them worth rebuilding.
What it meant to you. Remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons. This is really important for the channel. Really important. And if you're ready for another story of love and hope, click the first card or the second one to watch the full playlist. See you there.